You know, I studied law just a little bit over 50 years ago, and I wondered then, what was it that my legal education was about? And here I am, some 52 years, 54 years later, with the same question being put in front of me. When I first came to China in 1972 with my mother and father, during the Cultural Revolution, we went to Beijing University at my request, and they gave us a good account of the situation of the university, and at the end of it they asked if there's anything that we would like to know more about. And I asked if I could see the law library, and caused a certain amount of confusion. And eventually they said it was locked. And my father said, well, can you unlock it? More discussion. And eventually they agreed to show me, one of the first people for several years to see the law library in the university. And when we went in through the locked door, I was surprised to find the library consisted of a lot of English and other Western law books. And I looked like that. And they asked me what was wrong. And I said, well, when I came to China, I expected to find a different basis for law than the law books I read in England. Perhaps I was 54 years ahead of my time. But that's where we are today. We're in a world where there are different forms of approach to law that are beginning to surface, leading to some arguments, some difficulties, some tensions. But we should be comfortable that there is no single law. The Romans tried it, others have tried it. But the forces of the world change so often that you can't rely on things staying the same. And that is where we are now. People talk about the international rules order, and people talk about Sharia law and other laws. The reality is that the world is moving and changing towards perhaps a convergence 100 to 150 years out. But we are now in a period of change. It is not that the international rules order has no relevance or use in all the new emerging parts of the world, like China. It is where the force of law comes from that is creating some of the tensions. And it is the belief that the areas of law need to be able to be managed by the different parts of the world in their own different ways. So we have now BRI. So BRI is a economic, transportation, social system, call it what you like. It's transformatory. There's never been anything like it in the world, and it's compressing into a relatively short time scale a transition to a new era of economic development, social development, and probably cultural and his other forms of development. The approach to law in BRI will be very much influenced by the civilizations that surround it. And there are several in Asia which date back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we would be fools in the West to believe that they're all going to conform to the rules order that we have used for the last 200 to 300 years. In fact, there is no rules order of the last 200 to 300 years. It's been a changing rules order as the realities of the world have changed, the scale of the world has changed, and the problems faced by the world of business, the world of governments, and so on, have changed. So law is always changing, and the BRI will produce changes that are going to be of considerable concern, considerable interest to people all around the world, because we're all going to be affected by BRI. It's opening a huge new trade corridor from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and it's going to bring with it the need for adaptation. So whilst we look at the law of the sea, whilst we look at the international rules order, we can hang our heads and worry about the differences that exist, or we can accept that differences are natural, and the job of the international jurists is to work out ways of addressing them effectively. One of the reasons that London is well regarded is because it's shown an ability through the case law approach to adapt to the changes occurring in the world. And that is a good thing. As we go forward now and we look at legal education, we must encourage young people to be open-minded about the different civilizations of the world, about the different histories of the world, and how they're now beginning to have an effect on each other, ourselves, our communities, our regions, our world. If we look at COVID, if we look at climate control, we can see all the potential for differences and different approaches. We can also see that recognizing that and committing ourselves to finding solutions will help us get through some of them. About 30, 40 years ago, I put together the first big, really big joint venture in China. There were features of it which required a lot of changes to the Chinese system, legal system for joint ventures. And because I could show benefit to the Chinese side considered those changes and made many of them. One of them was when I proposed that the board of the joint venture should be 50-50 with no chairman's deciding vote. Many of my friends, particularly Chinese friends, raised their eyes in horror. Not only because of the enormous change involved in it, but how they would explain it to their seniors. But they asked me, why do you suggest a 50-50 board when the foreigner will only have less than 30% of the investment? And I said, it's very simple. This meeting of two different cultures, this meeting of two different systems, and that's what it was, one from America, the other from China, will only work if they commit themselves not to making decisions by power, but by making decisions by a collegiate approach to decision making. Eventually the Chinese said to me, well, what happens? Tell us in practice what will happen. And I said, in practice, there will be a meeting the day before the board meeting to consider the issues that are going to the board meeting. And where they can't be concluded to the satisfaction of both sides, they're put to one side. And the board meeting goes ahead and discusses all the things that need to, and can be resolved. And they said, well, what will happen to the issues? Could be very important issues. Yes, I said, yes, of course they could. It's probably what they are, relatively important. What will happen to them, they said. And I said, there's the force of the pressure to make it work. That's what will happen. And people will begin to look at compromises and solutions, and that is exactly what happened. The pre-board meeting happened, some issues were left to one side because they couldn't be agreed upon. And between then and the next board meeting, not the one the next day, solutions were found. I know of no situation that wasn't ultimately resolved because both sides wanted to find solutions which would make the business profitable, successful, and expanding. And that is what we must rely on here, that law will continue to drive the participants to find solutions. Not that we will rely on laws imposed from above and we're all forced to accept conduct which many of us don't find acceptable. So when the Chinese system, which stresses more on avoiding dispute, comes into conflict with the Western system, which provides the mechanisms for arbitration and mediation, but court as the solution to a difference, they work out a way of dealing with it. We should not try to stop China having its systems. We should not try to make China adapt to our systems. Goodness me, China was doing its approach to dispute and civilization hundreds of years, thousands of years ago. We should give it respect, we should give it understanding. But China will also respect our approach, which has managed to manage the processes of commerce over 300 years now, during which time the capitalist system has made enormous changes and strides in the world. So as we approach this conference, and we thank Tsinghua for their open-mindedness in letting people express different opinions about it, my one takeaway is this. If we're open-minded about the differences between us and we strive to understand each other, then we will find the innovations and the changes necessary to manage the differences that occur in day-to-day life between people, between companies, and between nations. And if we can't quite find the solutions quickly, we continue the process. Many times this will be done by a system of arbitration, a system of decision-making in the courts. Sometimes it may be best to just take a little bit of time and find the right way forward gradually.